Hello, welcome to our recap on war poetry that we covered in class. So a little bit of context before we get into our poems. So World War I began in August 1914 and it ended in November 1918. Australia fought on behalf of the British Empire and the Allies. Australia was, it still is part of the British Empire, so if the British go to war, Australia goes to war. That's certainly how it was in World War I. However, unlike most other Allied countries, including Britain, Australia did not have conscription into the military. Conscription is requiring somebody to sign up for the military. We did not have that. All of our soldiers were volunteers. Although tens of thousands of volunteers enlisted when war broke out, these numbers fell as the war progressed, not only because there were fewer people who hadn't already enlisted, but because the news coming back from the war was there were heavy casualties. Thousands of young men were being killed. So this obviously made some people a bit more circumspect about enlisting for this war. Okay, so our first poem is Acrostic ANZAC Day by Gladys Brown. This was printed in the Wagga local newspaper for ANZAC Day 1916, the first ANZAC Day. Okay, so this was actually, the newspaper actually asked for poems, and this was a poem that was written for that purpose and for ANZAC Day in 1916, so we're in the middle of the war. Okay, it's an ANZAC poem because if you have a look at the first letter of every line, it actually spells out ANZAC Day. Okay, so I'll just have a read through the poem and then I'm going to have a look at our smile analysis of the poem. Okay. Awake, arise, ye Waggafold, and hail the glorious morn, never to be forgot by us nor millions yet unborn. Zeal for the right inspired the souls of our brave and noble sons, and sent them forth to battle against the might of German Huns. Come then, awake, each do his part, come one and all, arise, do something worthy of the day of noble sacrifice, and show the boys who did their bit that we will do the same. Yes, gladly we will share our all with those of ANZAC fame. So this is this poet entreating her readers to follow in the footsteps of those who have already gone, and the brave and noble sons that have gone forth into battle already. She's trying to get those who are still in Australia, who haven't yet enlisted, to step up, do his part, be part of this noble sacrifice for the right. She's using this very strong language. This is the imperative tense of the verb. So this is an instruction. This is, you must do this. You must awake. So you must wake up. You must get up. You must go into battle for us against the Hun. Do your bit. Be part of this noble sacrifice. And we will remember you forever. Okay. So we're going to have a look at our smile analysis. Alright, so we've said already it's an acrostic poem, it's a single stanza, and as everyone pointed out in class, we have a nice regular rhyme scheme. So morn, unborn, sons, Huns, rise, sacrifice, same fame. Okay. The message is a call to arms. She's encouraging her readers to step up, step forward, and join in this battle against the Hun. It talks about the different imagery. The imagery I get is of, these women who were not able to enlist in the army in the same way as men could, but they took it upon themselves to actually go and, encourage people, talk to people, give speeches, and also kind of intimidate men who they felt should be in the army, but who were not. So these very patriotic women who felt it was their duty to get all these people doing the right thing and fighting for us, for our freedom. So the language, she uses a lot of very what do we call it? Emotive language. Okay, so we've already got these, these imperative verbs, like, you have to do this. I'm telling you what to do, you've got to do it. But we've got glorious morn. We've got zeal, this, huge energy, enthusiasm to do the right thing. We've got brave, noble sons. We've got noble sacrifice, yeah, and we've got ANZAC fame. And don't forget that this ANZAC fame was very recent. The Gallipoli campaign had only been the previous year. So the sort of, this ANZAC Corps, Australian New Zealand Army Corps, was very new, but they'd made a huge impact already on the Australian sort of psyche. So she's using very, very elevated language. She's really trying to paint war in a kind of a glorious, noble, heroic light, and that these young men are warriors going off and doing battle, against the enemy. And we talked about effect. So the effect is the effect on you. What effect does this poem have on you? But we also need to think about the fact that we have a different perspective. So when we're reading this poem in 2019, we know how the war ended. That gives us a very, very different perspective. So we know the war ended. We know that the British and the Australians and the Allies won the war. We know that that win came at a huge cost. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed for that war, but we ended up defeating the Germans. In 1916, this was not known. There was a concern that because Australia didn't have conscription, it wasn't requiring people, wasn't forcing people to join the military and go and fight, that we wouldn't have enough soldiers and that it wouldn't be enough to actually win the war. So we have to really think carefully about what it would have been like in 1916. Reading this in your local newspaper, hearing this sentiment as you're going about your business, how this would make you feel. Okay, so the effect it has on you is very personal. It's your own reflection, but we kind of have to take that context into consideration also. Okay, our next poem is very different. So we can see that this poem was published in 1919, so this is after the end of the war. The war ended in 1918, this was published afterwards. We can see that it's already another very short poem. We've got 5 lines, 1 stanza, and we can already see without too much trouble that we have a very regular rhyme scheme. We've got said, read, dead, hun, son. Very short poem. As you know, I'm a fan of very short poetry, and I feel that a lot of short poetry packs a really, really big punch. Okay, let's have a read through. Our loss was light, the paper said, compared with damage to the Hun. She was a widow, and she read one name upon the list of dead, her son, her only son. So, very short. The loss that we're talking about here is the loss of life. We're talking about the numbers of soldiers, nurses, civilians that were killed during the war. And this newspaper is saying the Allies lost fewer people. We had fewer people killed than the Hun, the Germans. And I'm guessing they're celebrating that point. I suppose it is something to, consider. Yes, we lost fewer people. Still lost a lot of people. So in this newspaper where it's saying the loss is light, there's a list of the dead. And this woman, who's a widow, she's lost her husband. She's reading down the list and she finds one name, her son, her only son. So she has already lost her husband. We don't know whether or not, he was also in the war and killed in the war, or perhaps he was killed previously, we don't know. But we know that her son, her only son, was killed during the war. So we have loss from different perspectives. We have the loss from the nation's perspective, or even from the British Empire and the Allies' perspective, and then we have the loss from a very, very personal perspective. The fact that she's lost one person is possibly more devastating to her than the loss of all those other people. So again, if we look at our smile analysis, so our structure is just a single stanza, 5 lines, and just this little AAB rhyme. The message is putting loss into a different perspective. So, the fact that we lost fewer people than the Germans is of absolutely no comfort to this woman who was already lost her husband, now she's lost her only son. The image I get in my mind when I read this poem is of a woman reading this newspaper. And possibly this is how she finds out that her son is killed, although they used to send telegrams. And that shock and devastation when you read something like that. I can't even imagine it, to be honest. Just that it must be huge. The language is very, very simple. So we have this little rhyme scheme. So rhyme can emphasize certain ideas, emphasizes certain sort of ideas in the lines. But the only real technique we have is this repetition of son, her only son. So the repetition, but also that emphasis on her only son. And again, similarly to our other poem, the effect of this poem would be different. 100 years ago, the war was over. People are, like this paper is, counting up their dead, trying to, come to terms with these losses that, whatever, they're less than the Germans, but still they're pretty darn significant. So our perspective 100 years later is going to be very different. We can try, so poems like this help us to try and put ourselves in that place. They can help us try and imagine what this would have been like. I find it a very emotive poem. It really makes me feel a great deal of empathy for this woman and her loss. And the fact that this little scenario of a woman who'd already lost, reading about another loss, would have been repeated across the country, across the world, on both sides of the conflict. And I find it, it's really, really moving. So again, the effect in your smile analysis is your own personal reflection. What does it make you feel? What does it make you think about? What effect does it have on you as the reader? Okay.